Arcades. The one place where you wouldn't feel bad feeding the capitalist empire of video games, simply because you're having a damn good time doing it. My name is Dan, welcome to Freeplay. Today we're taking a look at a certain genre of games, arcade games. They're fun, but it's certainly not fun when you want to take the arcade home with you, especially not when the arcade cabinets are ungodly expensive. Arcade one-up isn't exactly the best choice either, which is sad because they used to be. However, it's also a good thing they're pricey because, given the criticisms I've seen about these things, it's probably for the better. However, arcade game distributors knew that this was the exact problem most fans were facing, and so they partnered up with a bunch of other companies like Digital Eclipse and Mass Media to release a series of games for home console. Let's start off with the most notorious.
Midway Games.
In the late 80s, early 90s, Midway, what was known as Williams, would team up with Digital Eclipse to release a series of arcade games for the home computer with Williams Arcade Classics, but that would later spiral out to home consoles such as the Super Nintendo and Genesis, and then later on with the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, with Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits. After Williams, for the most part, was acquired by Midway, they would change this into Midway Arcade's Greatest Hits, or Midway Presents Arcade's Greatest Hits. They would have 2 volumes for Atari games, and 1 more volume for, yet again, Midway-related games, but also Burger Time because they had the license. They would later release a few more special kinds of games, like the Arcade Party Pack, which was basically just a bunch of multiplayer games, so you could take the PlayStation out, get a multi-tap, and max out an experience with friends. Though don't play Volume 2 of the Atari collection on your PS2, specifically Paperboy. You will not have fun. Midway Arcade Treasures was kind of a better evolution, for the most part, which featured more games in 3 entire volumes, if you don't include extended play for the PSP. Say, since we're still on the topic of Midway games, did you guys know that Robotron 2084 was the inspiration for the original Postal?
Hi there.
How do you keep coming back here?
Hey, it's not my fault. Book the kid with the keyboard.
These games were kind of... Well, Volume 1 had your classics. Volume 2 was trying to segue into the more modern age of arcade games. And Volume 3, we just don't talk about. Extended Play was kind of a hybrid between Volumes 1 and 2, because, well, hey, we want you to have some of the more classic games, but we also want you to have some of the more modern games. So let's just throw them all together so that way you can take it on the bus. Then get beaten up on the streets by a bunch of Nintendo boys because they saw you playing a PSP. Meanwhile, they're sitting on the streets trying to aim their console in direct sunlight so that way they can at least see what the fuck is going on in their game. Clever move, Nintendo. Later on, Midway would make a last hurrah of sorts with Midway Arcade Origins on the PS3 and the Xbox. Case in point, in this era, they released Midway Arcade Origins on a console that has no game, and then they released it on a console that can't game. This generation kind of sucked unless you were, like, one of the many lucky people that had a Wii. I feel bad for those that had a PS3, but I feel even worse for those that had an Xbox 360. This collection kind of felt like a last hurrah, like a final goodbye on a deathbed, which makes me ever so depressed because, I really liked Midway Arcade Treasures, and I would have loved to see it expand onto more consoles, like even on PC with Steam. But then again, it kind of defeats the point when you can just download MAME ROMs. G4 River does not promote the act of pirating ROMs, but what you do with them is your own business. I just saved this network from a bunch of legal trouble. Moving forward. You can't have an arcade collections episode without talking about Namco for just a minute. Though I'm going to go longer than a minute because there's a lot of them. Namco started releasing all of their games in the late 90s with Namco Museum on the PlayStation. This was a series of 6 discs if you consider the 6th Japanese disc to be a part of the franchise. But since it's not here in America, we're just not going to include it. These would feature a multitude of games per disc, but also really put that museum name to use, as in the disc was more than just game ROMs. In the disc was a full-on interactive museum for each volume. Each volume had specific parts of games and specific artwork and bonus stuff. It was just an actual museum. So you could play your games, but you could also learn about your favorite games, which made it a very good experience. And then later on, Namco would just throw that shit away like it meant nothing and team up with mass media to create Namco Museum on the Dreamcast, N64, and Game Boy Advance. In this collection, you get Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, Galaga, Galaxian, Pole Position, and Dig Dug. But if you were unfortunate enough to get the Game Boy Advance copy, Pac-Man was completely axed from the collection. It still doesn't make sense to this day. This collection would have been cool and all, had there been more games. Allow me to explain to some degree. You ever wonder how many megs Namco Museum as a whole is? Yeah, 4 megabytes. Which seems cool and all, until you start to realize just how much data could be stored inside of a GD-ROM on the Dreamcast. 1 whole gig. And Namco realized, yeah, that was kind of a problem, so they decided to remake this game and reship it, but with more games, so that way it could max out how much data could be stored onto a disc or a cartridge. This time around, it was all just discs, and it didn't make it to the Dreamcast. Big sad. This edition would come out only on PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. This one had just what you would have gotten in the last edition, plus Pole Position 2, a few arrangement games from the Namco Classics arcade cabinet lineup, and some bonus games if you were good enough at some games to unlock them, like Pack Attack and Pac-Mania. Though, for me, I'm a petty player, so I decided it was a pleasant idea to use a Game Shark instead. Fuck you to the designers. Later on, they would re-release this collection, but with a few more games in Namco Museum 50th Anniversary, to celebrate Namco's 50th Anniversary and Pac-Man's Big 25. This game had a few more games inside, like Rolling Thunder, Sky Kid, Mappy, and even games you've probably never heard of, like Dragon Spirit. It's a pretty okay collection, but nothing more, nothing less. A better UI, though, with classic music that I'm not allowed to play because YouTube's Content ID system is kind of a fucking joke. In the later years, they tried to take Namco Museum and make it a portable series. Then again, they kind of always did with Namco Museum on the Game Boy Advance, and some other Game Boy ports earlier on. But this is the more important part. Starting off with Namco Museum Battle Collection in 2004, this collection has a bunch more arcade games and all those arrangement games, except they're completely redone for the PSP. After that, you had Namco Museum DS, which is lacking, as it markets itself having 8 games, but in reality, you're only getting 7, unless you have friends. So basically, you only have 7 games, compared to that of its predecessor, the Battle Collection, which had about 20 altogether. While yes, there's no multiplayer on the PSP, it's got game sharing. So if you had another friend with a PSP, you could just give them a demo, practically. But overall, I think the PSP would win this one. The last collection I know of, really, in the Namco Museum franchise, is Namco Museum on the Nintendo Switch. This has a bunch of arcade games, but a lot more obscure titles like Splatterhouse, Galaga 88, Iron Tank, and Rolling Thunder 2. It's a confusing mix, but I'm not going to complain about it. It's Namco Museum and I'm happy. I just wish it was on Steam, though. I'm not going to review the Namco Museum archives that are on Steam because they're just the Nintendo Entertainment System ports. It's very misleading and it's very frustrating, too. Overall, the Namco Museum series has had kind of a bumpy road, but it lived long, and that's what matters most.
It's called an investment. Never said it was a good one.
This is the Miss Pac-Man Galaga Class of 81 countercade from Arcade 1-Up. It features 5 games in total. Miss Pac-Man and Galaga, duh, but they also feature 3 bonus games such as Galaxian, Galaga 88, and Dig Dug, because you can't have a Namco collection without a little taste of degeneracy.
Here you go, son. Just in case you want to commit suicide to spare yourself from the nightmares that you're surely gonna get.
That's the nicest thing you've ever done for me.
I like the tactile, responsive joystick. It feels like how it should be in the arcades. The buttons are a bit of a problem though, as sometimes when you're mashing them, they get stuck and it's a little off-putting. Damn it. The speakers. These little fuckers can get pretty loud. But overall, you get some quality games, some degenerate ones, some annoying ones, one that you've probably never heard of, and then your basic Miss Pac-Man and Galaga. The only gripes I can really say I have with this is, well, for one, the amount of space you get on the dashboard. You only get so much space. When you're playing Galaga, you have to like squeeze your hand in there pretty tight and match with like either 1 or 2 fingers. The other problem I can really mention here is that the marquee doesn't light up. Of course, you could just go and spend like 50 to 60 bucks on a custom marquee, but like other countercades already have that, so why not this one? Another gripe that I have with this is that this one isn't exactly the most moddable. It's not like Marvel Superheroes, the Arcade 1-Up cabinet, or countercade, where you can just stick a USB in it and it'll boot up its own BIOS and you can play all the games that you want on this thing. It's not like that. However, I am open to maybe seeing about putting a RetroPie in here one of these days, if and when I get the opportunity to make my Raspberry Pi work again. Overall, if you're looking for just a background display unit or something to put in, have just laying around, I would totally suggest this thing. It's not half bad. I wish that there would be more games. I wish there'd be shit like Bosconian or like, you know, the original Pac-Man and stuff, but this works pretty fine for what it is. I do like the art on the sides. I do love that they tried putting effort into like the glass bezel and the dashboard and stuff. I wish that they would have just not done this and instead tried to use screenshots from Miss Pac-Man and Galaga like they did in the actual Class of 81 cabinet and even on the actual Class of 81 Deluxe. But I'm not exactly going to complain because, again, this thing was cheap. It was a deal. So I have every right to shut the fuck up. If you're a die-hard Namco fan, then this is definitely the cabinet for you. If you're not, I would just get your hands on a Target exclusive Marvel Superheroes, mod that thing, and move on. Overall, the cabinet's pretty okay. And now's the part where I say that this is part 1 of 2. Yeah, I decided to split this in half so that way it'd be easier on my end to produce. I don't know when part 2 is going to be made, but as far as I'm concerned, it's going to be talking about Atari, Sega, SNK, and Taito. Maybe others if I find more. Who knows? Who cares? My name is Dan. This has been Freeplay. Thank you all for waiting patiently. I'm sorry you all had to see some of the things that you had to see in this special. Here's some eye bleach. Till next time.
Hi, I'm Moby, and you're watching G Forever, TV that's always plugged in.